What's up, motivators? It's Demetrice here from Claire M Motivators, and today I am here with a very special guest, my friend and colleague, Allenna.
Oh,
And today we wanted to talk about something that hopefully everybody's talking about. We wanted to talk about how to be an ally to people of color. Unless you've been living under a rock, racial conversations have been happening in the US since really early on, but specifically in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, it became the topic of national conversation here. And honestly, all over the world, people started talking about race. And in my experience, I know that there were people who had difficulty doing that. And so we just wanted to be an example of showing people really how to have the conversation, provide tips for people who are looking to be an ally to people of color, so that we can all get through this together and figure it out, because it is a huge issue that we definitely wanted to come to the table and address. I know that these conversations can be uncomfortable for people. I don't find them uncomfortable. I know Allenna, she does not find them uncomfortable. At least it doesn't appear that way to me. And so understanding that, we definitely want to be sensitive to that. I know that, like I said, there are people who have a very hard time talking about race, and I don't understand why. Because I feel like until we start having conversations like this, things are going to stay the same. And hopefully everybody's on the same page and wanting things to get better. And one of the ways that I think we can do that is by connecting, having allies, and making this a very, 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 making it a priority. And so I just wanted to start off by just talking about my background, and then Allenna's going to talk about her background as it pertains to race. And so for me, and I've shared this before on our previous videos, I grew up in the inner city and I was raised in a predominantly Black environment, and Hispanic. And so as a kid, I was surrounded by really nothing but Black people and Hispanic people. I remember the first exposure that I had to race. I was actually about 4 years old. And I remember getting in trouble for referring to myself as white or peach. I was like 4 years old talking to my dad, and I said apparently that I was white because as a kid, not understanding race, I just look at my skin and I'm like, black, like my skin is not the color black. And so I said I'm white, and I got in trouble for that. And so that was my first exposure to like race and it being a thing. And then as I got older, I remember my mom sitting down with me and having conversations with me about being Black. And one that really stands out to me was I used to play across the street with this girl, because the neighborhood that we grew up in, early elementary school for me, it was a little more mixed, even though our school wasn't. There was like an Asian family down the street, and then a couple of white families that lived across the street. And there was this one girl that I would go play with that was white that lived across the street. And I used to be able to like go in her backyard and play with her. And then after like a couple of weeks, she wouldn't let me back in the backyard. She would only play with me through the fence. And I was like, what in the world is going on? And my mom noticed that one day, and she sat me down and she said, long story short, essentially that she realized that whenever that girl's dad's truck was there, that I was not allowed to come onto their property. And the dad had like a Confederate flag on the back of his truck. And my mom never talked to them, but she assumed that the reason why I was not allowed onto their property whenever he was home was because I was Black. And so I remember her sitting me down. I had to have been in like the first or second grade, and her telling me that there were people who had issues with Black people and that I was no longer allowed to play with her. And she had to have I remember her specifically saying, "You are not an animal. You are not going to play with another kid through the fence." And I was just like, okay. And so that, like I said, is when it starts to click that, like, oh, this is a thing. And like, this is something that's serious. And then as I got older, race was always a topic of conversation. I remember like Rodney King happening and my grandpa talking to me about that. I remember having the talk like when you start driving and how you should interact with police officers. Race was always a topic of conversation. How you had to carry yourself as a Black person, that, the things that my mom would say about like, you have to work 10 times harder and there's no room for mistakes for you, that, you're going to go to college. Like it was always tied to race. And so it was very surprising to me when George Floyd happened, to hear people say things like, and now we're finally talking about race. I'm like, what? I'm, in my 30s and I've been talking about race since I was a kid. So, what about you? What was your experience growing up, demographics and exposure to race?
Yeah, and you and I have never talked about it so much like that in depth of what you're saying. And it's just so interesting. And I understand when you say that when George Floyd happened, people started saying, now we're talking about race, because I have none of those memories, right? So I grew up and interestingly, why I think you and I are such a good mix of this is I grew up in your exact same city, right? We grew up in the same city.
Right.
And I went to private Catholic schools, and there I didn't have much exposure to Black people. There were a few Black people in my school, but not very many in my high school. I think in my graduating class from high school, which was all girls, I think that there was one African American or one Black person in my graduating class, right, out of 200. So none, right? And I remember one time you and I were having a conversation and you said, and then I get to SMU and it's like, you had grown up in an all Black neighborhood or all minority neighborhood.
Right.
And you were like, oh my gosh, what is this? Which I just remember when we had that conversation thinking, when I got to SMU, I was like, look at this diversity. Like, truly, right? I had never been at school. Funny. I had never been in school with people of other religions, really, right? Like, true. I remember going to SMU and people inviting me to a Bible study, and then getting there, and then it was all like, we invited you here because you're Catholic. I'm like, that's right. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't even know
that was the diversity
people. That was like the Catholic. So, I didn't, as a white person, right, and going to school with the white people, we didn't have conversations about race except for conversations that were things that were talked about in school, right? So if you learned about slavery, if you learned that we don't call people Indians, you call them Native Americans, right? Like, those were the race conversations you have. But, and I remember, the school, the private school that I went to, the Catholic school, was mainly run by Jesuit priests and of Catholics and of priests. They're pretty forward thinking. They, were the ones who marched with Malcolm X in Orleans. I mean, they have a history of that. And so there was always this discussion about diversity for my grade school and discussion about diversity for my high school. And let's put diversity at the forefront, and this should be something we focus on. And this is why it's good. And this is why it makes you better. But I can't say that it happened necessarily, right? It was a lot of talked about it, and it was couched in this very good way. But I don't think in practice it was really happening. But in terms of these really, and maybe that's why when you say it's not uncomfortable for me to talk about, when you and I started having lots of these conversations, it wasn't really until I think my job, when I started having really meaningful conversations with not only people, but Black people about this issue, because it really wasn't, I would say it wasn't even super available in my life before, if that makes sense. Not necessarily, and I don't think a purposefully cut out type situation.
Right. It just
wasn't.
Right. For what?
Really,
and I know you recognize even the privilege in that, right? The thing that I can't escape is the thing that you get to say, I don't even, we didn't even talk about it. And it's, like you said, we're the perfect mix in the sense that we grew up in the same city. We ended up at the same undergraduate university, and then we ended up working in the same place. And so two people that came from two completely different demographics, you're talking about your high school, and I'm like, there was one white person at my high school, and you had one Black person.
One, right.
And so suddenly we're in these spaces where we're working together, and we're, we all think that diversity is important, but how do you take that and put it together? Like, how is it that you're able to do that? And I think for a long time, diversity was such a huge conversation. It was the push. And then I think people started doing the check-in boxes. Yes, we got a Catholic person. Yes, we got a Black person. Great. But then the inclusion piece came, where it's like, well, these spaces are not, they're diverse in that there are people present, but people don't feel included, which leads to other issues. And so I think that leads us to being an ally. There are words that came up in 2020 that I hadn't even heard before. And the concept of being an ally to people of color was one concept that was new to me in terms of talking about it in that way. And then also the term anti-racism. I hadn't heard that before, but once I heard it, I was like, yes, like that is exactly what we need to be talking about. So I know what I think an ally is, but what do you think it means to be an ally to people of color?
Yeah, I mean, and I will agree with you. I didn't, those are certainly not words that I ever entered my vocabulary. But as you know, I mean, when 2020 happened, right, and everybody's kind of at home and in their feelings anyway, and then George Floyd happened, and I know you and I specifically talked a lot about, like, I mean, we were like podcast junkies and like
Right.
listening to like all these people, and so it was a good time to kind of, all right, well, I'm sitting here anyway, you know, or I'm in the car like listening to that, and that's where I started hearing those terms. And so kind of hearing, you know, to hear about ally is something that I heard about, you know, from other people, right? And
Right.
like not necessarily forming my own definition, but the idea that it's not enough to kind of what I just said in terms of my entire background, which was, well, we talk about diversity and we are inclusive, and if a Black person applied here, we'd certainly, there's not an issue with that. But is that allyship? Is that making an effort to say, no, I need to use all that privilege that I just talked about, right? All these things that I never have to consider any of this, to step into the zone where I can support the people who had your life experience, right? Who had to talk about race, who had a person in your neighborhood who wouldn't let you play through the fence, right? Like using what I have just because of how I was born to be supportive of what somebody didn't have because of the way they were born, right? And that it's, to me, it's instead of that thought and process of we just don't talk about it or we don't recognize it or being colorblind, and instead being far more intentional, right? And I think, you know, I think we're also at a little bit of a disadvantage because we're in the South and we're polite, right? So
Right.
much polite, so much
Right.
polite.
Everything's about being kind and polite and hospitable.
Yeah, and so that kind of works against that idea of stepping into it or stepping out of it. And so to me, being an ally is going into your office or going into your world and just saying, can we have this conversation, right? And or what did this person say to you? Can, you know, or maybe if it's a situation where somebody didn't feel comfortable saying something, but I don't feel uncomfortable saying something, that to me is more being an ally.
Right. Right. And I obviously consider you an ally, or so I wouldn't have asked you to do this video with me. But one of the things that I've had the hardest time with, because even as I listen to you talk, it is so effortless for you to say, I had privilege and I grew up with these things that you didn't have. Like that is so effortless for you. And I talk to people, white people, who don't have that they don't even have the recognition that there is privilege that comes with just being white. And I know I've talked to people who were poor and white who also have a really hard time because they're like, what privilege? I don't have privilege. I grew up poor. I had to struggle. And it's like, yes, that is true, but your life wasn't harder because you were Black. And I'm not
Right.
trying, you know, I'm not comparing the struggle. Being poor is hard. I don't care what color you are. But I think understanding that concept that because of the way things have been structured, whiteness gives people privileges, and being able to just state that as a fact. It's not rude, it's not uncomfortable, it's not untrue, it's a fact. But I know some people don't understand that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people, I mean, and I'm not, I mean, tons of people, right? And I'm not saying I'm necessarily right about any of it, that it's hard for because it makes you immediately feel like you did something to get ahead that you shouldn't have done.
Right.
To me, I can say it because just like I'm saying, I was born with it. Like I was born with it, right? Like I didn't do anything to earn that privilege. There are things that I have done to earn things for sure, right? But I didn't do anything to earn that. And so it's okay. And it's, to me, also, it's one of those things, it's like, there's no other kind of privilege that people get so offended that they have, right? Like if people have money, like, you know, people have money, and if people like, they show it, right? And this is like the one kind of privilege that people are like, no, that's not real. Because it is, right? And it's, and I think, you know, maybe it's what you and I do for a living, or the things that we can see glaringly different. Or just, I mean, or maybe having such a contrast, or being able to be an adult in this situation, or maybe it's even raising kids.
Right.
Right. Like, because I feel like, and I'm sure you feel the same. I learn a lot just because I'm having to teach things to other people
Right.
now who are actually listening to me, good, bad, or ugly. And so, I mean, I can recognize that when I look at somebody who is my exact age and born in my exact city, the things that I had that got me a foot in the door differently, to me, that's undeniable.
Right. I feel the same way, but I have talked to people who that part is hard. Or I've talked to people who say these conversations make them feel attacked. Because like you said, like I didn't do anything. I was just born, right? Same for me. I didn't do anything. I was just born. So there are people that I have talked to in terms of like they want to be an ally, but it's also difficult for them to have a conversation like this without feeling attacked because they're like, well, I'm not that girl's dad who wouldn't let you play through the fence. Or times have changed, right? I'm in my 30s. So that happened when I was in second grade. That was a long time ago. And I think people tend to focus on, even in some of these conversations, it's like, well, when did you first experience racism? And we're like, oh, we're so glad that was so long ago. But ask me when the last time was, and I guarantee you it was within the past couple of years.
Right.
Maybe yesterday, right? Like it's still happening right now. And so I think that, like, I know that there are people who want to be allies. And like you said, especially in the South, a lot of it is like, I'm just going to be kind and I'm just going to be nice to people and I'm not going to treat people poorly. And I think that mindset is great, but it also, if we stay there, we're going to stay where we are. Like, we're never going to move past it unless there are people like you who are decision makers, who are in higher, able to change things, that say, you know what, I am going to be intentional and make a commitment about eradicating this problem.
Well, and one comparison, and I don't know where I got it, so I'm stealing this from somewhere. Copyright someone. That talked about what other, when any other change was wanted to be achieved in the world, what other messaging or focus was ever packaged up in like, let's just be polite about it or say, I'm not going to do that. Right. And so an example that was given was like when you send your daughter off to college, and I remember these talks, and I remember in high school, and I remember, date rape and those sorts of things when those were, in what other planet was it like, let's not talk about it. Let's be polite about it.
Right.
You just be safe. You just take care of yourself. I mean, no. It was, let's teach everybody. Let's have classes. Here, video. It's orientation. It's at your sorority. It was all of it, and it was activism. And so I don't understand necessarily how it's this backseat. And I think the feeling attacked is, I think it comes from a little place of shame, even if you don't know why. Right. So, I don't, you feel attacked because you feel like maybe you're complicit in it, even if you're not. And then you're like, but I didn't do that. And so then you just go to this place. Well, it's just not helpful. Right. And so it's like, I just think those are harboring emotions and feelings that are not helpful. Right. And it's not listening, and it's not the way that you approach anything else. Right. If you want, it's conversations. And so it's setting aside that attacked feeling so that you can move forward. Right. Otherwise, just like you said, we're stuck.
Right. And I don't think, for some people, they may never get to the point where they don't feel it. They don't feel the shame. They don't feel attacked. But I think that you definitely have to get to a point where you sit in that and you understand, like, if we're not uncomfortable, then we're not doing our job, because comfortable means we stay the same. Uncomfortable means we grow. So let's be uncomfortable.
Yeah, all the time. And it's, and I will say, this person, I can't quote, Brene Brown, who does all she does is talk about, shame is her big thing. And it's such a useless emotion, right? It's not shaming people. I mean, on both sides, right? Shaming people doesn't help get your point across. Me feeling shame doesn't help me move forward. And so that is, it's just not, it's none of it's helpful. Into changing it or having conversations about it.
Right. And to Brene Brown's other favorite word, vulnerability, I think that it has to be present on both sides. It requires, I'm okay with it now, but there was a point in my life where I would not have shared that happened, because it is a feeling of shame for me that somebody thought that there was something wrong with me, or me having to prove that, I'm not that, or that, I just don't have the space to carry that with me. Now I understand that sharing those experiences is eye-opening for people who don't know that things like that happen, or they don't know that I experienced that. Because one thing that I found in being an attorney and having made it to a certain point, that people assume that I'm not like the others, right? Like, you're different, you're not like them. And it's like, wait, no, I've experienced these things, and there requires a level of vulnerability on both sides. Even for you, you've had moments where you're like, ah, man, I think I might have messed up. Did I? And we can have that conversation. Or for me to say, hey, Allenna, I experienced this and this kind of feels sucky. Has this ever happened to you? And we're able to meet each other in that space. And it's okay. There's no shame. And we're, both having to be vulnerable. And I don't think everybody's there on either side. I talked to especially some Black men, my husband being one of them, who these conversations are very difficult for them because it requires them to be vulnerable and to expose themselves. And for people in the Black community, weakness is not an emotion that we can have. Like, that is just how you were taught. Feelings are bad. Weakness is bad. Like, you have to be strong, and you just have to take it on the chin, and you just keep marching forward. And I think now it's a new concept, even talking to, people my mom's age, where it's like, no, we don't have to just take things on the chin. We've had that conversation before. You don't have to just deal with it. You get to speak up. You get to say, I want allies. You get to say, hey, it's the anti-racism for me.
Right. And I think that, and I mean, like, you bring up, Chris, or Black men in general. And I think when we talk about feeling attacked and that vulnerability, I would think that that's white men too, right? Because they feel like, just because I'm a white guy, I'm not all these terrible things, right? Like, that everyone wants me to be in. But I think the other important thing you said is, like, this thought that the vulnerability is a weakness. And it's, that if I'm vulnerable, if I say, hey, if I name it, right, which we always say that, you and I like say, let's just need to name this, you need to
just
put it
name it. What is it? Yes.
Just name it. What is this? That vulnerability in saying something is a weakness, which, interestingly to me, I feel like when I have called you before and been like, okay, I did this thing and I messed up. Like, I said this and I didn't mean it this way. And like, what is your thought on this? That didn't feel weak to me. You know what I'm saying? Like, that vulnerability felt like, okay, that was a little bit powerful to me because I'm fixing it, because it's going to be better for it. And because instead of me feeling upset about something I said or did and carrying that around in my head and being all in my head about it, I named it, I said it, I got feedback, and I fixed it. And like, isn't that actually the opposite of weakness, right? Exactly. And so I think, until you have that experience, you feel like being vulnerable is going to be a weak and sad feeling, and it's not. And I don't know how to tell people, except for, again, the way that I like explain things to my kid, like, you're just going to go back to school tomorrow and it's going to be better. And I only know that because I did it,
Right.
But I think it's just hard to step into that, and that's change, right? And change is just hard.
Yeah, it is hard, but we have to do it. Do you see anti-racism as something different? Like, what does anti-racism mean to you then? Is it the same as your description of what an ally is, or is it different?
No, I think it's different. Well, I mean, I think the term anti-racist is important because nobody is going to say I'm a racist, right? I mean, people are going to be racist, but those
maybe
are
some people,
right? Yeah, they're going to say they're, but like, are we? That's just not anybody's audience, right? Like, we can categorize them elsewhere if you're part of that fact. Everybody else would say I'm not a racist. I don't feel those things. I don't think those things. I think in and of itself, I think if anybody is alone in their head, they think I have done something, I have said something, there is something innate that I think that is racist. And even if you just think of like how I act now, or what is normal now versus what was normal 5 years ago, or for God's sakes, this year, 1 year ago, right? And so that to me, that's the idea of racism, right? But then being an anti-racist to me is more what is the conversation, right? It's not just saying I'm not a racist. It's saying I am seeing something over here that is systematically racist, and I would like to say something about that because I am an ally, because I have privilege, maybe because I have a voice, maybe because where I am, but I see this and that needs to change. And that to me is different than saying I'm not a racist. That is being an anti-racist.
Yes. Absolutely. Perfect example because this actually happened. Maybe I feel like this year has lasted for 5 years. So it's hard to keep it in context. But I think this happened last year. I was talking to somebody who was so proud to come and tell me that they were in a barbershop and it was a white guy and his barber was white and everybody in the room was probably white. And he said, my barber said something really racist and I can't remember what it was. He told me what it was. And he's like, can you believe that? And I was like, yeah, I can believe it. What did you say back? And he's like, well, I didn't say anything because, he's my barber and it's uncomfortable or whatever he said. And I told him, I said, I'm actually not offended by what your barber said. I'm more offended by your lack of saying something.
Right.
And so that to me, being anti-racist is in those spaces, like you said, when you hear something, when you see something, or when you're, in a position where you're making decisions that affect people's lives, are you being anti-racist? Are you intentionally focusing on this issue and speaking up about it? I always say this, you will inevitably be in spaces that I'm not in, or at least the conversation will be different than if I was there. I feel like people are more comfortable saying things around people who look like them than they would say to me. And so, because you are present in these spaces, you have more power than I will ever have to be able to say, hey, that's not okay, or whatever it is. And I know for me, because of an experience I had with the white guy who's a friend, I do kind of take for granted how hard that is for some people and what that could mean, right? Like that guy may have had to not have this barber anymore because it may start an argument. Or maybe somebody's family members may be like, you can't come back to my house. And so I don't take it lightly that it is challenging, I think, to be anti-racist, but I think it's worth the challenge.
And I agree. Yeah. And here's the thing. I think that I also think that people think, like, we use the terms ally and we use the terms anti-racist, and they are strong terms, right?
Yes.
And so I think people think that what is expected of them day one is to go around and say, I was born white, I'm privileged, we are all racist, and if my barber said something, then I'm never going back there.
Right.
And that, I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you expect that of anybody. I think you and I all day celebrate really, really small victories in a lot of things that we do, right? Look at that little change. Right. It has nothing to do with racism, right? Because I think that, it took a really long time to get here and get bad. And so I hope it doesn't take anywhere near as long to get better.
I know.
But I think that people think that the idea of being an ally or being an anti-racist is radical because that's the expectation, that you eliminate all of your family and your 102-year-old grandpa who uses words you don't use anymore, and you just write them off. But that's not the expectation. And I just don't think, I think that response is not, it's just like you said, because it's going to be challenging. That response and saying that's too hard is just giving yourself the out to not participate.
Right.
Whereas if you participate in small ways or little ways, or make the choices where you can, then you are doing a part, right?
No,
better than doing the polite thing.
Right. And not for me. And this is another thing. Obviously, I am one Black person. She is one white person. We cannot speak for everybody. So for me personally, I always tell my white friends who reach out to me, because people know that they can come and talk to me about this and I don't mind, that you find the role that you're comfortable in for your life. Don't just be comfortable though. Don't just be like, I'm gonna just keep it right here in this little box because this makes me comfortable. Challenge yourself, but don't feel like you said, that it has to be this radical, so against your personality or so against who you are as a person, because you're never going to stick with that. You're probably never going to start that because it's intimidating. And so, maybe protesting is not your thing. It's not, I don't do that either. That doesn't mean that you're not an ally. That just means that you have to find the way in your life, in the space that you're in, that you can implement the concepts that we're talking about. But it doesn't have to be some radical. For me, there are some people who want that. I am not one of those people.
Well, and I think step one in terms of being any of those things, is having my ally, right? Is having having, the people in my life that I can, because I'm no expert in it, right? Because we talked about how I grew up and what my life was. And so having people that you say, that you come to and you can ask questions of, but also recognizing that that's not your job.
Right.
And that's not fair to put all of this back on you. But to be if you are predominantly a speaker and predominantly a person who runs conversations and you have the ideas and you have the thoughts, that this is your moment to be a real good listener, right? Because that's how you're going to develop the ways that you're going to be able to adjust yourself, right? And you can't do that if it's just you thinking of the next thing you want to say.
Right. You kind of touched on some earlier, but I know that you don't find these conversations uncomfortable, but there are people that do, and white people specifically is what I'm asking you about. What tips or advice do you have for people who do want to be an ally, people who do want to be anti-racist, but they don't necessarily know how to do it or where to start?
Yeah. Well, for starters, I mean, I think we laughed about this example, right? Of we heard, I forget what we were listening to, but like all these white people showing up at the black church and be like, "We're here to be allies," right? Like that's not the right way to do that, right?
Show up at a black church like, "Hey, I'm an ally.
I'm here. I'm your ally now." But you know, I mean, you have to listen. You have to open yourself up to it. I mean, sometimes if you approach it like you approach anything else, if you wanted to be really good at gardening, you'd probably read a book about it, right? Like if you'd want to learn how to cook, you'd probably read a book about it.
Yes.
And there's so much material. And even if you don't want to read a whole book, you can follow good people on Instagram who can talk about it. You know, who can talk to you about how to do those things, because sometimes it is just a learning, it's a rewiring.
Right.
The conversations I think are uncomfortable for some people because a lot of times you've lived in a space where you don't have any Black friends, you don't know any Black people, you know, that's still your adult life. Well, you have to evaluate in your own life, well, what is it that you're doing that is still limiting you to those spaces, right? A recognition that that's really limiting who you are, right? That's
right.
It's not putting yourself in the best place for yourself to do that.
Right.
And so it wouldn't be uncomfortable as uncomfortable. Let me say that. It wouldn't be as uncomfortable if you were putting yourself in a little bit more space to be around people where those conversations shouldn't be uncomfortable, right? And also finding trusted friends on what I guess is the other side, but not the other side, right? Where you can have a conversation with, have an honest conversation with. And you know, I think maybe like, I don't know how you and I ever had our first conversation about it, but I think it's, hey, I don't want to be offensive, or but can I ask you this, or can I say this, right? And you can real quickly figure out if somebody is real offended by that. And then you just maybe stop and move on to something else.
Right.
Just, you know, just approaching it as a learning objective like you would anything else until it's not uncomfortable for you. You feel educated about it. You feel like you're making the decisions that are comfortable to you that you want to make, right? And so I think, I mean, just approaching it that way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I've all the people that have come to talk to me, it was that very thing. One, it was just kind of like you said, putting yourself in spaces where you are able to get to know each other. So even though we weren't necessarily talking about race, us being around each other, being exposed to each other's lives, knowing that we have everything in common, it's like, okay, I'm already comfortable. And then when you toe dip a little bit and then you say something about race and the person responds, like you said, I can tell, okay, I think it's safe for me to say this or have this conversation. And then a lot of people specifically after George Floyd happened, asked, can I talk to you? And this is what the conversation is going to be about. Are you okay with that? And so I think that that was a great way to start. And I also think that if someone were to say no, because like I said, you know, everybody is in their own journey when it comes to this. If someone is to say no, it's not my responsibility to educate you. You need to educate yourself. You just got to take that, you know, and it doesn't mean that they're being crappy to you. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that that person feels like it's not their responsibility. For me, I don't see it as a responsibility. I see it as a privilege to be able to be that space for people where we can have conversations like this and they know, you know, you walk away and I walk away and hopefully you learn something. Hopefully I learned something and we can commit to making this problem better. You said this earlier, the tips that I have for people who want to be an ally was see color. And you said this earlier. And so I just wanted to expound on that a little more because I had a conversation with somebody recently who I don't think he ever thought about it this way. But I know a lot of my friends who are white have said that when they grew up, it was like, we don't see color, we treat everybody the same. And this being a new concept that we're like, well, no, you, first of all, that's not true. You see my color, right? Hopefully you don't define me by said color, but you see it. That's like me saying, I don't see that you're a woman, that I'm not even, I don't see, not like, that just doesn't make sense to me, because it's like, obviously you do see it. So we're
Right.
not saying don't see the color. We're saying don't make assumptions and don't treat me any differently based on what you see. So if you are of that mindset that like, I don't see color and I treat everyone the same, ask yourself what's so wrong with seeing someone's color.
And I think a lot of that comes from our generation. I think our generation was a don't see color generation. And I will tell you, even just, and I'm like kind of calling a friend of mine who we were texting on a text chain, but it's not like offensive. But, and again, going back to, again, we're both moms and having kids and the things you teach kids. And they have lived abroad for a long time. They lived in Europe and France, and then they lived in Dubai and then Spain. And then now they've just moved to New Jersey. And she said, yeah, she was texting and she said, yeah, when we first got here, my son kept on just saying like that black girl. And she was like, and so we had to correct that. And I just wrote back, I go, to what? Like, what? Like, isn't it a black person? Like, I don't, it's not, he at age 3 was not making an assumption. He was identifying that black person versus, the other person standing over there. And so I think that there's that thought, like, squash that, don't say that, don't recognize that. But it's like,
but even that's hard, because it's like, I want you to see that I am black, but I don't want to be defined as the black girl, right? So, but the hard part about explaining it to kids is they don't understand nuance. And so
I don't think he was making an assumption. I think he's like, that person.
Yeah, it's like, see the color, that person is black. There's nothing wrong with saying that. But if you're defining them as that black person, it's like, no, I am so much more than just that. I am a lot of things. So,
and I think that is where that I bring up that example, because it's like, it's tricky.
It is. It is. That's what makes this hard, because it's like, in some context, it is okay. And in some context, it's like, well, wait, whoa, not too far that way. Like, it's okay to say it, but don't make that the thing that you define them by. So you said this too, as terms of a tip. Listen, like, when we're having these conversations, listen with an open mind, listen with an open heart, and listen really with the intention of understanding. And I think that the thing that was frustrating for me was that it took all of this to get to the point where people were willing to listen. Like, the thing that people are now reading in books and having epiphanies about, I'm sitting here like, I think people have been trying to tell y'all that for a while, but nobody was listening. And so I think that in any conversation, right, I think the focus should be on just listening and trying to understand.
Right, because it's going to be a different experience.
Right.
And maybe part of that vulnerability is people feel like if they have to listen, then they have to surrender their ability to disagree, which I don't think that's what anybody expects, right? Like, you can still have an opinion and you can still disagree. Now, that might make it a little bit difficult to get to some common ground,
right?
But the listening is what gets you at least to have the conversation.
That's the start. And then too, like you said, it's like, in terms of it being tricky, just listening in the sense that you're like, Demetrice, tell me everything. I'm gonna sit here and listen. And then I just pour my heart out to you about all these experiences. And then you're just like, okay, I listened. What? No, like, that wouldn't be okay. Like, I expect you to comment back. I expect it to be a dialogue. I just don't expect you to negate my experience when you start talking. Like, that is the difference for me. Like, when I say listen, it's like, put on my lens for a second and understand that my life has been looked at this way, and try your best to empathize with that. I think we actually covered all the tips in some way. So I have build relationships rooted in equity, in that you expand your perspective by having friends, not just people who work for you or people who, do certain jobs for you, being of a different race, but people that actually are considered your peers, that look different from you. Even for me, I have friends who are African. My experience is different from theirs because they come from a different country. And my experience here is different from theirs. I have friends who are white. I have friends who are Hispanic. And I have learned so much just in everyday conversations and interactions. And so if you don't have that, I think you should. I do obviously think that for some people that may be difficult. Like you said, you don't want to just show up at a Black church looking for friends. Like
Yeah.
it has to be organic and
Yeah,
genuine.
but there might be something that you're doing that is actively going another direction,
Right.
right? You know,
Right.
and but also just like you said, not approaching it like checking off a box, but approaching it like in equity, right? Like,
Right.
because I appreciate that this makes me better, right?
Right.
And you know, I mean, and that sometimes is an easier way to get there for people.
Right. And then we've talked about understanding privilege. One thing that I did have that I don't think we talked about was white people not making their feelings more important than the lived experiences of Black people. And so when we talk about those feelings of shame or feelings of being attacked, feelings of disagreement, whatever those feelings are, not focusing on that, right? You can have the feeling, that's your business, but not focusing on that to the extent that you stop listening and you stop participating because it's too hard. I think that listening to the lived experiences of Black people and trying to understand their perspective, even if you don't get it, even if you think that it is irrational, even whatever it is that you think about it, you can't make your feelings more important than their experience. So if you feel like racism or systemic racism is not an issue, you can't make your feeling about that more important than what I'm telling you my experience has been.
Yeah, I think that that goes exactly to like I think our most favorite phrase, which is two things can be true, right? So like you have had this whole entire lived experience and maybe, and I'm not saying but I don't think any of it's correct. So, but those two things can be true at the same time and neither one of them outbalances the other. And you just, and people cannot grasp that two things can be true. But two
It's the
things
hardest thing.
it's the hardest thing in the world. It's everything and two things can be true. But I think I think that is where the shutdown comes from.
Yeah.
Thinking that you can't have both. But I think that is, if everybody would just have a t-shirt that said two things can be true.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
No. And then I have be an advocate in real life, not just on social media. I think we do live in an age now where there are people who are allies or anti-racist in their mind, and they will change their picture to the black box or, post a picture of them doing something that they believe is anti-racist and then turn off the computer and then that's it. But like we've said, if you're not having experiences in your day-to-day life where you're speaking up, where you are expanding your perspective, you're expanding your friend group. If you're not doing that, in my opinion, you can do more.
Yeah, I mean, that's the difference between saying I'm not a racist, right? I've changed my box to black. I'm not a racist, or being an anti-racist.
Exactly.
Like, what did you really do?
What did you do? Right. Mm-hmm. And then the last one that I have is teach your children. Like, I think that each generation, it gets a little bit better, but then, it kind of doesn't in some areas. But because we're talking about things like systemic racism and institutional racism, it's everywhere. Housing, literally everything, criminal justice, it's everywhere. It's not going to get better until we make a commitment. And for me, I really do think about my children. I have a daughter and I have a son who are both Black, and I need this to be better, right? Like, when we know from the work that we do that maybe we don't fix it. And sometimes looking at a big issue like this and saying, how do we fix it, can be scary because it is so deep and so rooted in everything that we do, that I think about it in terms of how can I make this better for my 2 children and for your 4 children? How can we make this better for them? And one way that I think we can do that is by having honest conversations with them, and doing it together. Like, bring your friends that hopefully we talked about your friends looking diverse, and y'all have a conversation together. They have games that you can play with your kids to kind of spark the conversation, and really making a commitment to teach our children in a different way. Like, even for me as a kid, I know there are people who had different experiences, but for me, a lot of the stuff that I learned was from school in textbooks. There wasn't a lot of research on my own. Like, I just learned about the stuff in school and then the stuff that I was experiencing in terms of education. But for me, like, I've made a commitment to actually reading and thinking about the stuff that I learned in school. It's like, okay, that's not the whole story. There's more. And having those conversations with my daughter's 4, but she loves Disney movies, for example. And so when she's watching movies and she's looking at Rapunzel and she's like, her hair is magical, thinking about the fact that I have to tell my daughter her hair is magical too. Her hair doesn't do that. Her hair doesn't look like that. Or on Halloween one year, she wanted to be, I think it was Elsa. I got to figure out as her mother, how do I give her blonde French braids, right? Like these are considerations that I'm having to make. And I have conversations appropriate for a 4-year old, obviously, about that. And thankfully, Disney does have Tiana now and different princesses. And so I did it from that lens. Like she understands Disney. So I can point out to her that these people look different. And then we can talk about wherever her mind goes. In her mind, it was just like, and they're all beautiful. And I'm like, yes. And as she gets older, those conversations will grow. And then she sees that my friends look different. And so hopefully when she's our age, it will have been a little better because of the work that we did.
Yeah, I was listening to there's a person named Kate Schatz, and she and I was listening to a podcast that she was doing, and somebody was asking that exact question. Like, of course it's going to get better with each generation if we teach our kids what we teach them. And she was like, but somebody had said it's so hard to talk to your kids about something like this. This is so difficult. And she said something that stuck with me that is so obvious. She said, no, it's not. Kids are obsessed with fairness and equity.
They
so
are.
It's actually the easiest thing ever.
The best time to catch them.
Right. Yeah. Because I thought about it and I'm like, you're right. If one of my kids gets an extra fry from Chick-fil-A, then the other, like we're going to talk about that
right.
ad nauseum,
right.
because they're obsessed with equity. And so they, better than anybody, would understand that this doesn't make sense, that things are unfair, unequal, that equity doesn't exist for whatever reason.
Right.
And it's actually not hard concept for them to grasp at all, And
right.
so since that was said to me, which then was so obvious, you really realize that you put that out there and they get that, right? They're not, and we know kids are so resilient and kids understand better, kids are better than we are any day of the week anyway.
Right.
And they, and that is so true. It is so not as hard as people think it's going to be.
Right. It's really not. The question that we always end at with Clear and Motivators is what motivates you? And so specifically, I'd like to ask you what motivates you in terms of being an ally, for you to believe that we can have more people be allies and we can do the work to make this issue better.
Yeah, I think what motivates me is that because of what I do for a living, right, I get to see a really huge, broad spectrum of my community, right? And that's not necessarily something that I grew up with, where I got to see a really broad spectrum of everything in the world. And so I can really look at things and say, there's a lot of unfairness, and there's a lot of things that worked out for me that didn't work out for other people that I didn't earn. And I can look at the way that people are pointed at and said, this should work out for you. Why isn't it? And I see that that's unfair. And so something that motivates me in terms of that is I want not only for things to be fair, I want not only for, like you said, my children to be in a world where my children and your children have the same experience.
Right.
But I also want the other fraction of the people who are pointing and saying, like, why can't you do that all on your own, to just have an epiphany where they realize because things are not fair, right?
I didn't put myself in this position on my own.
Right. Because I can do something to affect making things better for you.
Right.
And so I want, obviously, again, as a parent, you want things to be better for kids, but I want things to be better for people my age. I want things to be better for all of that, right? I mean, I don't want to be an experience where George Floyd continues to happen, where where this division gets worse. I don't want that. And so I think all of that is motivating to me to try and do any little thing that I could do to improve upon those relationships.
Right. And everything that you just said is what motivates me. So it's definitely,
it's a good thing we're neighbors.
I know, right? It's definitely getting to a space for me of having people who get it. Right. Like, I think for me, and I will be completely honest and vulnerable, there was a period in my life, and I think it was also me having to do some unlearning, where I was raised where it wasn't safe necessarily to trust white people, just being completely honest. And obviously they don't mean that globally, but that is kind of what you take away as a child, that this is something that is unsafe. I remember specifically being told by a family member, they might be your friend in your face, but I guarantee you if they get mad, they're going to call you the N-word. So it was like, even when you think you can trust someone, don't trust them too much, because when they get mad, all bets are off. And so that was the space that I lived in, you know, up until I got to college and I was able to say, oh, you know what? That hasn't been true for me. And so it is being able to have unlearned some things myself and to talk to people like you and my other friends where I'm like, you know what? No, there are people who get it and there are people who care. And so what motivates me is joining with those people and figuring out what can we do in our own way, small, big, whatever it is, what can we actually do instead of just talking? Like, what can I do? How can I commit myself to this cause so that we can make sure, like you said, that things are better for us and that things are better for everybody who comes after us, people who work with us, whomever it is. What can we do to make this space better? And so I've found great comfort in having conversations like this with people who get it. So yay for you.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know that it was, it takes a long time to learn all that too, right? Because you have to learn to be offended, you know, I mean, you just get some clarity. You know what, 2020 is helpful for clarity though.
Yeah, 2020.
Let's talk about it.
2020 vision. And then this year has been like, okay, God, I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, we get it. So
yeah, let's talk.
I know, right. So I think that's great. I really hope that everybody watching learned something from the conversation. We definitely encourage you to have your own conversations. Like I have said many times, these conversations are not uncomfortable for me. And so if you are looking for somebody to talk to about it, if you have questions, whatever it is, you can definitely reach out to us. We're interested in hearing what you think in the comments. If there's something that resonated with you, or if there's something that you disagree with, we're open. Everybody's welcome here. Their opinions are welcome here. And so leave us a comment and let us know. You can always reach out to us at booking@claireandmotivators.com. If you need anything at all, we do these talks publicly, virtually. Now my husband and I have been doing them because some people just don't know where to start. And so hopefully we have given you some ideas of where to start and how you can have these conversations amongst yourself. And so with that, unless Allenna has anything else to add, we wish you all well and we hope that you have a good week. Bye.
Bye.